but why don't we take a moment to introduce ourselves to each other's audience? You go first, Emily.
Great. My day job is a global health epidemiologist here at the Duke Global Health Institute. I do research working at the intersection of children's health, like cancer and surgical diseases, like congenital anomalies, you can think of that, um, and poverty. And so my work focuses in countries like Somaliland and Tanzania. And then I do really big, nerdy modeling studies on the impact of poverty on children's health. So a little bit of advocacy work. During the pandemic, I started a Facebook page mainly for my mom called the Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist to explain, what does flatten the curve mean and stuff. And at the time, we were in Texas. I'm a pastor's wife in the Christian faith. And so I found myself at this weird intersection of everything you were seeing on the news about the pandemic, conspiracy theories. I was in the heart of it. And so I think because I was writing through the lens of love your neighbor on epidemiology, it just kept going viral and has grown to a reach of about 10 million people in 80 countries. And I continue that work on Facebook and Substack. So that's kind of a side gig for me, which I just have found to love
Mhm.
working. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, as a recipient of your newsletter, I must say you are an excellent communicator on these topics. I'm really excited to speak with you. And for those of you who are part of Emily's audience and not a Global Dispatches subscriber yet, I suppose, I am Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a veteran international affairs reporter. I cover the United Nations, global health, international development, all the sorts of all those aspects of international affairs. I also do more harder side of foreign policy and international security and national security stuff as well. But my heart is in these conversations for sure. And I host Global Dispatches. So thanks everyone for joining me. So I figured what we would do today is kick off by me asking you a few questions about the ways in which these new moves by the Trump administrations are impacting our ability to confront and contain diseases around the world, particularly infectious diseases, and whether or not, big picture, our ability to defend against pandemics has been incapacitated by many of these moves, including the withdrawal from WHO, including the foreign aid freeze, including the dismantling of USAID. But to kick off this conversation, I would like to take a little bit of like a global tour of diseases with pandemic potential that are concerning to me as a more passive observer. And I'm kind of interested in your take on them. And you mentioned that you have done a lot of work in Tanzania. So let's start with Marburg. Now, I take it Marburg virus is something of a cousin to Ebola, but far deadlier. Can you just explain what is Marburg and what's happening in Tanzania, and how concerned are you for its potential to become even a worse outbreak than we're seeing today?
Sure. And can I just say hello to everybody? I see these names and I know at least in part some of the names and people hearting. So thanks for joining us. This is going to be fun. And also now we're going to transition to talk about Marburg. I mean, in Tanzania, I go to Moshi, Tanzania. It's at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, on the eastern side. If you go to the northwest corner in the Kagera district, that's where at the end of January, they kind of sent out an alert that there are 9 people who are very sick, and of those, 8 had died. So that response triggers something within the global surveillance system where they started testing for things that certainly look like Ebola or Marburg. And I have my notes up here like a good epidemiologist. So if you see me looking, I'm looking at my numbers. Since then, they've confirmed 1 case of Marburg and are following 25 suspected cases as well. But I want to talk about that trigger warning system because the WHO has what's called the Event Information Site. And what that does is if there's a pocket of bird flu or a pocket of Marburg or really any disease, it triggers that site and it sends an alert to all of the member states or countries, if you will. and says, hey, something is going on. Be on alert if you see something that resembles whatever, like in this case, it's Marburg, especially if you are a border country, because where that Kagera district is in Tanzania, it borders the other countries. So, what happens when we pull out of the WHO? I say we as America, um, where we fund so much of the efforts that happen at the WHO, it can impede those surveillance systems, which it would impede the rapid response teams that go out for testing. And with something like Marburg, because it is so contagious, it's very different than COVID, where you could with COVID it spread before someone even knew they were contagious. Marburg spreads when you're contagious. So there's a little bit of a buffer there. On the other hand, you are severely sick with Marburg, and it's a bit disease as not agnostic at the beginning. It's very much vomiting and diarrhea and fever. When it gets to the hemorrhagic stage, is when you really know, okay, this is something more than just a stomach bug. All that to say, if you don't have good surveillance system, a rapid response to go and test, it can spread really, really quickly.
And it's
Um,
super deadly, right? Like one of the
well,
deadliest diseases out there.
yes and no. And that in my book, I have an entire chapter about Ebola when that happened in West Africa. I'm sure you remember, 2013, 2014. Ebola and Marburg are not necessarily deadly. They are deadly in places with poor response, with unequal health systems if you don't have good supportive care. But in places that have good supportive care, it's not that deadly. Let me give you the example of Rwanda. So at the end of last year, Rwanda actually had an outbreak, and they have an Ebola-like Marburg outbreak as well. They effectively squashed it with good quarantine, with good testing, and with good medical care for those that were sick. So it's only deadly. I call it a disease of poverty. It's only deadly in inequitable health systems.
Mm. But in terms of it, like case fatality rates, it's something like
Yeah,
90% of people who get it or who have it in this current outbreak have died.
correct. But
Yeah.
average and overall, it's about
Mhm.
40 to 50%, especially if you get good supportive care. But in places where they don't, which is why the Ebola in 2013 outbreak was so horrific, it just could not be contained. And that's why the fatality rate was so high.
So you mentioned that the WHO kind of spearheads this disease surveillance system, and when there's an outbreak, it's alerted globally.
Right.
Now, having covered these issues from more from a political lens, less from an epidemiological lens, one trend that I've seen is that countries are often reluctant to self-report some
Yeah.
of these really sort of horrible diseases because of the immediate impact it would have on their own economy. They don't want to keep like foreigners away or foreign investment away. And so, this sort of international intervention, of which the CDC and USAID plays a key role, is crucial because it provides sort of a kind of neutral third party to want to alert these global systems, whereas the governments themselves might be more reluctant. And so, one potential outcome I see from the US withdrawing from any of these systems is like a you don't have those other eyes and ears on the ground that are not that don't have the same political incentives as the sort of local health authorities might.
Yes, and the countries can help in that way, but they can also help and send teams and treatments, and the World Food Program can be there if needed for assistance. So there's a whole cascade of effects that happens. It's not just about surveillance; it's also about treatments and hospitals being built.
Mhm.
So I do think you're there. It's hard for people, I think, to make the link between the U.S. CDC and the WHO in terms of these global epidemics, but you clearly delineated how those are connected.
So could we move on to Ebola in
Sure.
Uganda? just to the north of Tanzania. What is going on with that outbreak? How concerned are you? And what do we know about what the international response has been thus far?
Well, I'm always concerned with Ebola and Marburg just because it can take off so quickly. The outbreak in Uganda that you talked about, it was declared in January 30th, and there's a confirmed case that triggered again that warning system in the testing. Confirmed cases have risen to 9. However, 265 are now being monitored for
Mm.
a possible confirmed case. The first person to die was a male nurse in a different district. There's no other fatalities yet. I think that is because of they're getting people to care quickly. 7 of those are being treated in Kampala, which is in the capital city. It's actually where I got some of my start in global health is Kampala, and one other is in the eastern part of the country. You know what's interesting about this strain of Ebola? So there's different types. It's the Sudan strain, and that case fatality rate that we've talked about before is about 40%. There is an ongoing vaccine trial, and I want to highlight this because this is where dollars in foreign aid and philanthropy goes to. This vaccine trial is giving more than 2,000 doses against a strain in Uganda, and it's in the middle of an outbreak. So it's an interesting type of trial than what we typically see funded by the NIH. The beauty of that is a similar vaccine trial was used in the Congo in 2018 against Ebola, where they vaccinated 3,000 people, and it effectively squashed the outbreak very quickly. So that's where we are right now. I'm
Mhm.
hopeful that the containment that the government is doing, the testing, hopefully will work to catch other confirmed cases, but also that it won't spread. Also,
It's Oh, sorry. I just want to emphasize what you said about vaccines in the Congo. So there have
right.
been a number of Ebola outbreaks since the major West Africa Ebola outbreak in 2013. None of those became massive international incidents for the fact that there was and is a vaccine that was developed and deployed really effectively to contain those subsequent Ebola outbreaks in the DRC, in Congo. And those were, supported largely by the United States.
Right.
And so it's again, there is this like tried and true playbook
Right.
that the United States, in partnership with the WHO and other key international players, have used to contain Ebola since the major 2013 outbreak. And my concern is that this playbook is being kind of ripped up in kind of a fit of ideological vengeance by the Trump administration, uh, for not for any good public health reason, for other reasons that only maybe Elon Musk and Donald Trump can deduce. And it seems to me to just heighten the risk that
Yeah.
not necessarily this Uganda outbreak, but maybe any other outbreak in the future of Ebola might not be as easily containable.
Yeah. Or and it might be in these current in Marburg and Tanzania and what's happening in Uganda. We don't quite know yet because those aren't effectively over. But you're right. There is an epidemiology playbook to dealing with epidemics. That's what we that's what we go to years and years of school for to figure that out. And so it's not hard. It's partnership, it's containment, it's testing, it's treating. It's just by the book, which is why rapid deployment needs to happen in these areas.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I wanted to turn to bird flu
Yeah.
now. I, I guess first, can you just explain bird flu to those who are unfamiliar? I mean, I think we all have seen our egg prices rise here in the United States dramatically as a consequence of the massive culling of chicken flocks because of bird flu, but now it's infecting other animals, including dairy cattle, including some household pets as well. And there has been a death from bird flu in the United States just a couple of weeks ago. A man in Louisiana who had a backyard chicken flock died from the disease, becoming the first American to die from H5N1. Uh, like, what is bird flu? And is like the big danger here that bird flu somehow morphs from being something that occasionally infects humans who interact with animals to something that is transmissible between humans?
Yes, I think that's the whole answer there is, yeah, that's a huge worry. So much of a worry that, scientists have been studying a possible flu epidemic like that has jumped from an animal to human and then rapidly spreads, almost like what we saw in COVID, where it was so contagious and we didn't have anything to fight against it at the time. That is the real fear here, with it, especially with it mutating as quickly as possible. Now, what's even a little bit more worrisome to me is the more bird flu that is out there in any animal, the more that it has a chance to mutate. And same with COVID. The more where COVID was out there with humans, the more it gave it a chance to mutate, which is why we had Delta and Omicron and so many variations of it. So that's my worry: is will it one jump to humans, and will it mutate in a way that um, that could possibly impede our defenses against it from a treatment standpoint. So we're watching it. These surveillance systems seem super boring and fairly costly until they're needed.
Mhm.
But they are put in place so that they're not needed at a pandemic or an epidemic standpoint when it does jump.
So, what does the global surveillance system on H5N1 look like? What are the mechanisms of cooperation? What role does the WHO play in all this?
Yeah, same thing with that event information site. Same thing as Marburg. When they're tracking this bird flu, tracking a couple of other viruses that have potential for epidemic or pandemic, especially the pandemic impact. So we're tracking it, and so it's just it's just a simple lab test, and then it goes through the chain of command until it gets to that event information site, and then it can be dispersed to the member teams. So it's the same tried and true system for any disease.
Now, I have to imagine, that here in the United States, we actually have very, very good and strong disease surveillance systems, and bird flu in particular. But diseases know no borders. So I would imagine, and you know better than I, that one of the key functions of the WHO in situations like this is to support the kind of health systems in the developing worlds that don't have as such strong surveillance systems to do exactly what you said, monitor, report these cases. Like, what do you know, if anything, about how the US withdrawal from the WHO may potentially affect that global surveillance system?
Well, partially is because of the funding of it. The if you don't have enough people to work the surveillance systems like they're supposed to work, that's going to impede the timeliness that the rapid response teams can actually be deployed and hear about any type of outbreak. So that's one huge mechanism. I mean, we need people to do their jobs and be able to do it well. And I think that's just going to have the trickle out effect on being able to actually help the countries that don't have the surveillance system. But I guess I'm thinking more from a human standpoint. To me, one of the impacts, I don't know, that I really don't want to happen, but I see coming down is the deployment people. If you don't have people in place to actually go and to help squash the outbreak or test it, that are trained professionals and know how to do this, that will impact the ability to contain whatever virus that is. So that's a big worry of mine. Same with any virus, Marburg, bird flu, or Ebola.
Mhm. So, just like moments ago, moments before we spoke, the World Health Organization held a much anticipated press conference. It was like an hour-long press conference. Dr. Tedros headed it, but all of the key lead technical people were there on hand to answer questions from journalists. And as you can imagine, a lot of the questions were about the impact of the US withdrawal from the WHO and also other orders, like a basic, like a blanket ban on the CDC even communicating with
Right.
the WHO. And one of the key leaders of the WHO said that when it comes to bird flu, you know, because the US has such like a robust and surveillance system, it provided like a wealth of information about bird flu, not only to the WHO, but to the rest of the world. And for the most part, those system that the WHO is no longer like able to access those systems. Now there is some narrow methods of communication that still do exist. The WHO said that the United States is still reporting some human infections of bird flu through what's known as the International Health Regulations. This is a treaty that establishes ways in which countries communicate with each other about diseases of particular concern. And so there is some communication still happening there, which I suppose is heartwarming. But interestingly, the people at the WHO says they're not getting their information from the CDC anymore. They're getting it from the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is not under the same restrictions yet, at least, from communicating with the WHO.
Huh. Well, good. At least where they're getting something. I mean, the CDC websites that have just gone dark and reporting systems. I mean, we certainly see that with the flu. That is just whamming families right now here in the US. It's really hard to know. Well, it's up now, but it was really hard to know who is at risk. Um, the same thing for globally. So I'm glad they're getting some information.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the flu because I didn't quite realize this. You know better than I, but apparently, every year around this time of year, the WHO convenes like scientists from around the world, including from the CDC, who share very like technical information about the specific kind of flu virus that's circulating, so they
Yeah.
can build their flu vaccine for the next flu season. And and this is like really critical information because you want to have like as good a flu vaccine as possible. So you need the CDC's information on the flu virus that's circulating here in the northern hemisphere. But the WHO just like doesn't know if the US scientists are going to show up and share their information that's just like apolitical. It's just like information about various strands of flu that's going, because they don't know if they're going to be even like available or allowed to participate in this scientific meeting.
Wow. I hadn't heard that update yet, but
Yeah, that was from the press conference moments ago.
yeah, that's really unfortunate, especially with something like the flu that when you have a bad year like we do right now, it can just pummel health systems, which is certainly what's happening across the US. And then if that trickles to other countries and there's a spillover effect, which typically there is, and those hospitals aren't equipped for it, that feels unequal. There's a solidarity aspect to global neighboring of not only sharing information, but sharing some resources. And I think we see that with this recent flu outbreak not happening.
I understand that there's this like solidarity, and it's sort of where my it's where it's like why I care about these issues. But there's also this like profound self-interest, I think, that's embedded in global health cooperation, that you want to, from America's perspective as like the dominant funder and player in global health over the last several years, you want to contain Marburg in Tanzania or Ebola in Uganda so it doesn't spread to the United States. And another crushing blow to the global health disease surveillance system that I've encountered, having done a lot of reporting on this over the last several weeks, has been to what's happening to tuberculosis
Mm,
and the ability of countries that have high TB burdens to both continue the very inexpensive treatment regimen that goes with if someone is having a cough for several weeks, they'll go get tested very cheaply and they'll get cheap drugs. And after they finish their course of drugs, they'll be okay. However, that system has been interrupted because it was largely funded, or many in places by the USAID. And I spoke to someone not long ago who was in charge of the system in one of these frontline countries, and this person is just deeply concerned that the interruption of treatments on a mass scale that we're seeing happening may result in the proliferation of drug resistant tuberculosis, which is not cheap and can be quite deadly. And frankly, people are mobile. You can't expect TB that's extremely drug resistant to remain where the patient is. People move and people infect each other.
For sure. I mean, that I was just talking with another friend this morning who the same story, instead of TB, it was with HIV. And the issue of if you stop somebody who is on HIV treatment, there is a risk of drug resistance there too. And you have to go to a different class, or maybe there's not even a treatment available if you go through all of the drugs. So that is, the stop work order, even though there's a waiver of life saving um, interventions. I mean, what does that mean? That's very hard to interpret. But things like TB, you can't just stop. Things like HIV, you can't just stop. I don't know if you saw the recent article that came out showing that for every day that the stop work order continues, there's 1,400 children who become infected with HIV. And within a year, a third of them statistically will die.
Hmm.
Numbers are probably as dire for TB because TB is something that you certainly need to treat, and it's also highly contagious.
Yeah. It's just worth maybe emphasizing something about the mother to child transmission of HIV. That's something that here in the Western world, in the United States, almost never ever happens because there are tried and true ways of preventing that. However, the those drugs tend to be kind of expensive, and so treating mother and preventing the mother to child transmission of HIV is more difficult in the developing world where access to those medicines is much more difficult. Like you can be a mother with HIV and have a child born free of HIV, and that's like it's not like technically complicated. It's just kind of expensive. And now that's not happening. And to make matters worse, when you have children that are born with HIV, because juvenile HIV and youth HIV rates are so minuscule here in the Western world, there aren't very many drugs that are available to treat this. And those that do exist are really expensive. So you just have this like compounding problem when you're not stopping the transmission from mother to child of HIV.
Yeah, here in the States, there are 50 children born with HIV in a year. And so it is definitely doable to protect these kids from getting it. But the stop work order, that number of, I'll just give it to you again, 1,300 per day, that if the treatment goes away. And also they are expensive drugs, but this is where PEPFAR comes in. President Bush put this in order in 2003. It's a bipartisan group that provides these life-saving treatments to millions of people. An estimated 25 million people have been kept alive because of it. So they are expensive, but there's been things that have been negotiated to provide them at no cost to countries, and just doing the good neighbor thing for a treatable condition now.
Um, so Emily, like just kind of big picture, uh, what are most concerns you right now about not just like America's ability to prevent the next pandemic, but the world's? Like, how like likely now is our infectious diseases to spread more quickly because of the foreign aid freeze, because of the USA Stop Work Order, because of the pulling out of the World Health Organization? Like, are our pandemic defenses incapacitated, or at what point will they be incapacitated?
They are certainly impacted a lot, mainly because of the disruption, the abruptness of the stop work order and the foreign aid freezes, and all of that came about through the multiple executive orders. That just disrupts the whole system. And if a system within a country is already fragile, and I'm thinking of the surveillance system, to your question, that's going to be impacted because it takes people to run those systems. If we think of USAID specifically, most of the workers are contract workers on the ground. And so if you lose your job really quickly, you have to feed your family. And so you have to figure out something else to do. If the systems are turned back on, it's not as simple as turning on a faucet and getting them to run. Okay, again, the people might not be there just because they have to do what they have to do for their families, which I just totally understand. So I think the abruptness of the halt compounded the problem of the global surveillance in a way that if it would have been in a different way, not as abrupt, but with some, well, I actually don't know what to call it without getting in trouble. Maybe
It's
with
okay. We can use
integrity.
all sorts of we can say whatever we want on global dispatches. I know you're a more family friendly
Yeah,
Substack.
yeah, that's
um,
for sure. And I just do it with some integrity and some
yeah,
humanity in mind. It could it could have been different. So just to say all of that, I am very worried about missing things getting through the cracks. Because if the systems aren't in place and things aren't plugged like they need to be, there could be something like COVID that sneaks in, and then all of a sudden we are surprised by it. The surveillance systems, if it detects something that's funky and it triggers the warnings, then a lot of scientists can go and do their awesome work of not only containing it, but then running the like the genomics or the biology of it, so that vaccines can be put in place if it needs to be.
yeah.
So I am very worried about things slipping through the cracks right now.
So your point earlier about the abruptness of the foreign aid freeze, of the shuttering of USAID, I think deserves to be emphasized for the fact that the people who work at these agencies, the people who do like the on the ground and back end work of disease surveillance or of just like public health interventions, these are like very technical fields.
Right.
People have like very specialized expertise and know-how, and now you have potentially NGOs that specialize this going out of business, contractors who specialize this getting furloughed and out of work. So you can't just, as you said, turn it back on and expect all those people with all that accumulated know-how of decades of public health work and experience from coming back and resuming their jobs. You're going to lose a lot of expertise over the next several weeks or months. And I just fear that, as I said, we have gotten like very good at preventing pandemics, or at least knowing how to prevent pandemics. We've gotten very good at disease surveillance, but that's because the people are good.
Right.
They're good at their jobs, and now who knows? They'll find other jobs. They might be like working in a Starbucks to feed their family. This is a problem.
And it's not just disease surveillance. I mean, with the overarching abruptness of all foreign aid, to give you a personal example, I do work on children's cancer in Tanzania at the base of Kilimanjaro, and my 100% of my team is funded through federal funding. Now, so far we are okay, but if that goes away, that work is halted, and the children that come to receive cancer treatment there, I mean, they're coming from hours and hours away. They'll still get treated, but what I do is help protect their families from poverty because of having to pay out of pocket for lodging or for food. That part of it gets halted, or the ability to do the data analysis. My data analyst is in country, and the program coordinator and the qualitative researchers. So you are exactly right that if we lose that funding, we lose that in-country expertise to be able to do the job. So it is wide-ranging impacts.
So another interesting thing that just came from this WHO press conference. Again, this was like a much anticipated press conference. This was the first time that Dr. Tedros and his team of experts took questions from the press for an extended period of time since the American withdrawal from the WHO, or the announcement of the US withdrawal from the WHO. One other thing that became abundantly clear is how um, difficult responding to emergencies will be. Public health emergencies. Say there's like a massive cyclone somewhere in the Pacific, or unfolding disaster in Myanmar. Typically, the United States is the key funder, amounting for about like 39%, they said, of the funding of these like really like public these first responder interventions to sudden onset crises. And the WHO just like can't rely on that funding anymore. And this is like broadly part of the foreign aid freeze that's affecting the entire humanitarian sector, in which like four out of every $10, which actually isn't like that amount, that like huge amount of money, but it is a huge amount of money for the small humanitarian sector. They're just getting like devastated, and I just worry about a lot of the downstream consequences of the fact that you know there is no ability to provide malaria medicine, or treat people wounded in these kind of sudden onset emergencies, and the impact that that has going forward.
For sure. And like malaria is a great example because those are bed nets. This is indoor spraying against mosquitoes. And my colleague here at Duke, Dr. Gavin Yami, just did a great analysis where he showed the impact of abrupt pulling out of foreign aid, in specifically for malaria, in about 9 countries. And in all countries, you can map out there's a dip when bed nets and malaria spraying happened where it just squashes malaria, which is awesome. Then you pull out and it goes up. The malaria cases go up 10 to 16 times higher than what they were prior to the bed nets and the spraying. And so I really worry about things like malaria too, as well. Something else that you mentioned that I want to make sure we keep talking about and people know in their head, the funding for USAID is 0.4% of the federal budget. Foreign aid is 1.2% of the federal budget. So when we're talking about pulling this as a cost saving to the US government, it's a drop in the bucket. I wish that we could have kept the humanitarian portion and all of this funding as is, because it is so little. It's certainly not going to help our deficit.
I guess I'm wondering, having worked in this field for so long as you have seen the field like evolve and get better at stopping diseases and fighting diseases. And through my entire 20-year career of covering this stuff as a journalist, you have seen slow but steady progress, right? Against extreme poverty, against diseases like HIV, TB, and malaria. The progress is not as fast as I think we would all like, but by and large, it has been slow and steady. I've never lived in a world in which there has been sustained regress. There was, a lot of our good trend lines stopped and slowed during COVID, but they've bounced back. They haven't bounced back as fast as we've wanted to, but they have bounced back. What does a world look like where there is not slow but steady progress against infectious disease?
Well, in the nature of an infectious disease, the spread for some of these can be so high that it can compound. That's why you saw the boomerang effect of that 10 to 16x in malaria in those countries. So the digression of being able to fight against these diseases, including how climate change impacts. I know a lot of people don't want to talk about climate change, but the connection between global health and climate change is now just inextricable. And so if we don't track mosquitoes, for example, they're going to follow the hot weather. You see this in Houston. If you don't track where the mosquitoes are that are infected with Zika or something, that's going to impact the health on the ground. There's regression there into overall health. So, yeah, I'm so worried. I'm worried about people not getting vaccines. This has now turned into a super broad topic, so I apologize if I took us too.
No.
But my hometown is having measles now. West Texas, where I went to school, has a large outbreak of measles. I mean, these are preventable diseases that we've made so much progress on, but conspiracy theories have done their job and halted a lot of people from feeling comfortable and getting vaccines.
So I don't know, Emily, anything else you wanted to discuss? Any questions, any other things? I We can see, there's like a kind of an annoying
Yeah.
troll in the comments, so I don't want him to prevent the rest of you from asking a question. Open it up for a couple of questions if you have time, Emily. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Anybody
yeah.
have any, I tried to block him, but I can't. So
Yeah,
whatever.
that's all right. I've been writing on the internet since the early 2000s. I
Yes,
just ignore these things.
me
It
too.
doesn't, you get. Um, okay. All right. Well, we'll give maybe another minute for a question, but in general,
Can,
this has been a great conversation. I love doing these live conversations, and this is the first time I've done one with a fellow Substacker. So let me just take the opportunity to encourage everyone to sign up for Emily's Substack.
Thank you, and yours too. I also, if you're interested more in the Ebola story, I wrote a book about a year ago called "The Science of the Good Samaritan." If you're interested in that, so it's just a very accessible way to talk about global health and everything we're talking about, solidarity and neighboring. Mark, I do have a question for you because I know you've done so much more in the UN and policy type work. What do you think from a global health standpoint? How can this impact policy?
Well, I mean, you're not going to have the United States at the table, right? And a lot of these kind of conversations at the WHO Executive Board, at the WHA, the World Health Assembly, which is coming up
Yeah,
in May. A lot of decisions are done like by consensus, and you're just not going to have American input there. Now, historically, American input has been very valuable because of all, like, we just like are the ones with the wealth of technical expertise, and that dwarfs others. So that's going to be, I think, deeply problematic. Then you have things that are like largely U.S. funded through voluntary contributions, like basically the way in which the United States funds the UN is through like assessed contributions, basically membership dues payments to the UN, and then through voluntary contributions, paying for parts of the UN, mainly the humanitarian agencies. That's done basically on like a almost like a charitable basis. The US, countries pay what they want, and the U.S. has been a key funder for discrete programs and projects like the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which I foresee taking a huge hit right as we're on the cusp of eradicating polio. And so you're going to see, I think, a knock on effect of the US just not being at the table here. And furthermore, I think the deeper, more challenging policy and political issue here in the United States is that global health was never like a partisan issue.
right.
You mentioned earlier it was the George W. Bush administration, who I think is like one of the worst presidents of all time. He like did PEPFAR to his great credit, right? It
Yeah,
was an outgrowth of his belief in, compassionate conservatism, he called it at the time. But however you slice it, for a very long time, for most of the time that I've been following these issues, global health was not a partisan issue. Now, there was always, when you got into like reproductive health issues, there was always kind of tinged with domestic politics around abortion here in the United States. But malaria was never controversial. Supporting the WHO was never controversial. But now you have injected into this conversation a degree of partisanship that I fear might be hard to shake off going forward, that may forever make foreign aid something of like a partisan political football to the detriment of like foreign aid.
I definitely agree.
So yeah, that's my soliloquy.
That's.
Um,
I did see a couple questions, but there's so many in here. And
yeah, it's hard
roll.
to
They'll
hard to
just
get to.
roll
Well,
by.
we can look through them and answer them in the chat if we can.
Yep.
Uh, but Emily, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This has been lovely. There's so much to talk about. You mentioned polio, and we need to go there, and the
Yeah.
WHA, and we need to go there. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about. But thank you for having me. I think people are hungry for this type of information that's real and very honest about the ramifications of what's happening. So Thank you for your work.
Thank you. And please support Global Dispatches with a paying subscription if you do want this real and honest and open conversation. I usually do less talking in most of my most of my interviews. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right.